Hello there and welcome back to Planet America for the start of a new year and a new political era. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Licciardello.
This week, before Joe Biden rides off into the political sunset, we will take stock of the past 4 years with former Democratic Party Chair Howard Dean.
And we're going to talk to a disaster preparedness expert about the catastrophic fires in California. But first,
15 months after Hamas terrorists attacked Israel, triggering a massive Israeli assault on Gaza, a ceasefire was announced this week. If it holds, it provides a roadmap towards a permanent end to hostilities, a gradual withdrawal of Israeli forces from central Gaza, the release of dozens of Israelis and others still being held hostage in Gaza, and as many as 1,600 Palestinians being held by Israel. The breakthrough came less than a week before Joe Biden leaves the American presidency, and negotiations included representatives of President-elect Trump. And Biden was prepared to acknowledge the role of the incoming administration.
I'd also note this deal was developed and negotiated under my administration, but its terms will be implemented, for the most part, by the next administration. In these past few days, we've been speaking as one team. This has been time of real turmoil in the Middle East. But as I prepare to leave office, our friends are strong, our enemies are weak, and there's a genuine opportunities for a new future.
Magnanimous, pragmatic. Meanwhile, Donald Trump was trying to take all the credit.
This epic ceasefire agreement could have only happened as a result of a historic victory in November, as it signaled to the entire world that my administration would seek peace and negotiate deals to ensure the safety of all Americans and our allies. We have achieved so much without even being in the White House. Just imagine all of the wonderful things that will happen when I return to the White House.
Just imagine. And here's what Joe Biden thinks about Trump's role.
Who books credit for this, Mr. President, you or Trump?
Is that a joke? Oh, thank you.
Joke or no joke, Chaz, a lot of objective analysts are saying that Donald Trump does deserve some credit, at least because of the kind of Nixonian madman theory of the Palestinians know they're not going to get a better deal under Trump. Goodness knows what he's going to do. So we better take this deal now while Biden's still in charge.
of course he deserves credit. I mean, at least some credit. I mean, the timing is not a fluke. Like, the fact that this deal, apparently almost identical to a deal proposed on May 27 that Israel rejected, with 6 minor changes in the appendix, that is, at least according to Arab negotiators. If it was rejected before but accepted now, what's the difference? The difference is Trump. So, of course, Trump deserves some credit. But where I disagree with Trump is I don't think it's because he's a master negotiator and because they know he's going to stand up for Americans. I actually disagree with what you were insinuating just then, that it was the Palestinians that were the issue, the Hamas. I don't think Hamas are the issue at all. I think Israel was the issue, because the deal they agreed to was a deal that Israel walked away from. And at least according to Arab negotiators, Trump's aide did more to sway Netanyahu in a single sit-down than Biden's aides did all year. I think essentially what's going on here is that the Israelis, or Netanyahu in particular, knows that Trump is his best ticket. With Biden, he was hoping that Trump would come along and give him a better deal. Trump's come along now and said, this is your deal, take it or leave it. And he's in a position where he can bully Israel to take it. And that's what's happened. I think Israel has made the concession here, not Hamas. Yeah. And I think that Trump was in a position where he could make them make that concession. Now, whether it sticks is another issue altogether. Sure. But the fact they've made that extra step they couldn't make in May, I think is entirely down to Trump's relationship with Netanyahu. And I don't think there's any point pretending otherwise.
Yeah. Interesting echoes, of course, with the passing of Jimmy Carter late last year. It was on the day that Ronald Reagan succeeded Jimmy Carter in January 1981 that the American hostages being held in Tehran for over a year were finally released. And I think we're going to see reminiscent scenes of that next week with the release of hostages and Trump being given the credit. But again, analysts are suggesting that Netanyahu, in giving lots and lots of credit to Trump himself, is also about getting Trump on board with, let's go further against Iran. We've now shown that Israel can project its power into Lebanon and into Syria and into Iran. Let's get rid of that nuclear program for all time. Now's the time to strike Iran. And whether Trump goes along with that and whether the world goes along with that is going to be fascinating to see.
I think you're right that that's just one more carrot that Trump could offer Israel that Biden could not. Like, Biden was limited by his left on how far he could push Iran and how many concessions he could make to Israel. Trump has no such limits. And so there's all kinds of carrots on the table for Israel from Trump. Let's see how this plays out. I mean, anything could happen, obviously.
Yep, and we'll be here to watch it with you. It is midwinter, of course, right now in the United States. And while there have been massive snowstorms battering the East Coast and the upper Midwest, deadly wildfires, of course, have been engulfing parts of California, particularly around Los Angeles and Hollywood.
So far, the flames have scorched about 40,000 acres and destroyed more than 12,000 buildings and structures, many of them homes.
Over the weekend, firefighters did make some progress on the Palisades fire. It is currently the largest blaze, but authorities warn the threat is far from over.
Even as these fires continue to burn, a political firestorm has erupted, with plenty of blame being tossed around. It's the fault of the LA Fire Department, it's the fault of local officials, water management, land management. Democratic Mayor Karen Bass is to blame, Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom's to blame. Republicans in Congress in DC are even threatening to withhold billions of dollars in federal aid.
I think there should probably be conditions on that aid. That's my personal view. We'll see what the consensus is. I haven't had a chance to socialize that with any of the members over the weekend because we've all been very busy, but it'll be part of the discussion.
And here's a taste of that discussion.
Do you expect, though, that Congress and Republicans will still help these Americans in need, even if they don't like their local politics and the party?
I expect that there will be strings attached to money that is ultimately approved.
We will certainly help those thousands of homes and families who have been devastated, but we also expect you to change bad behavior.
They don't deserve anything, to be honest with you, unless they show us they're going to make some changes.
Now, as for what actually happened in all that, Chaz, we do know that some of the firefighting efforts were hampered by a lack of available water. They turned on the hydrants, nothing came out. There was at least one reservoir that was standing empty. That's being investigated. President-elect Trump, of course, is blaming Gavin Newsom, the California governor, for not redirecting water from elsewhere.
It flows down through, right through Los Angeles. I mean, massive millions and millions of gallons of water a week, probably, I think even a day. Massive amounts coming out from the mountains, from the melts. Yeah. And even without it, even during the summer, it's a natural flow of water. They would have had so much water they wouldn't have known what to do with it. You would have never had the fires. Of
course, experts say if you redirect water coming down from Canada, then you decimate vast swathes of Northern California. Species die. It's not the solution, but it's something that Trump, along with the raking of forests and other things that he's proposed in all of this. Have you got a sense as to who should be carrying the can for this?
There's a lot of theories out there, John, and look, not every contribution to this debate has been valuable. Alex Jones's theory, for instance, about the fires is that the Los Angeles fires are part of a larger globalist plot to wage economic warfare and deindustrialize the untied, I think it means United States, before triggering total collapse. To which Elon Musk replied with, "True." Thanks, Elon. But let's break down some of the theories that John just discussed. Okay, first of all, water. Trump's talking about water. At least according to the LA Department of Water and Power, they filled all 114 available water storage facility tanks throughout LA on the Monday before the fire, including 3 million-gallon tanks in the Palisades area. And according to a local water use tracker, at no time during this fire has there been a shortage of water in Southern California. Their reservoirs are full. So, what's the problem? According to LA Department of Water and Power, 4 times the normal demand of water was seen for 15 hours straight in the area of the fires, and that lowered the water pressure of the system, which in turn limited the pipe's ability to pump water at the speed needed to refill those water sources. So yes, there was one particular reservoir which was empty for maintenance reasons, but the water wasn't the problem. The problem was the water stopped flowing. The water they had, that was the problem. And contrary to many of the critics, a local ex-fire chief said, quite frankly, the water situation in the Pacific Palisades was best practice. To have a 3 million gallon hillside reservoir system is exceeding recommended redundancy by a factor of about 3. So the issue wasn't there wasn't enough water. The issue was they couldn't actually use the water resources they had. That's a tougher thing to fix.
Yeah, one of Trump's ideas is not about the extra water being used to fight the fires, but to prevent the fires by wetting down the landscape to stop the dry fuel load building up. That's at least the theory that he likes.
Okay, that's fair enough, but California is a very big place to irrigate.
Yeah, yes, I believe.
It really is. Anyway, okay, so then there's the whole area of controlled burning, brush killing, that kind of stuff, which is another legitimate area, of course, to try and reduce the risk of fires. And it is a difficult area because there's a lot of bureaucracy in California. Sometimes it takes up to 7 years to organise a burn or thinning of undergrowth because of all the bureaucracy, red tape, legal challenges, etc. But for a start, California does burn a lot of areas. It burnt 125,000 acres per year over the last decade or so. It burnt 250,000 acres in 2023. It is planning to burn 400,000 acres this year. There's also 560,000 acres of fuel reduction going on in California. So it's not like they're doing nothing, okay? They're doing something. Now, admittedly, that pales to what nature would want. In California in prehistoric times, there were about between 4 million and 11 million acres burnt each year, but that's hard to replicate, okay? But brush clearing is a legitimate issue. But here's the problem. At least as far as the Eaton fire goes, that fire seems to have begun in an urban area, which is not in the forest. So it's very hard to burn there. That's not an area where controlled burns would typically be done because those environments are obviously very hard to control, urban environments. So yes, it would be lovely if there was more controlled burning, and there can be more controlled burning. There can be more clearing of fuel to mitigate the fires, but it's just not as easily done as people pretend it is. They just throw around as if it's so easy to just clear all the fuel in a city. Yeah. That's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, and it's not as if Los Angeles doesn't have a smog problem anyway, so doing a lot of burning ain't great when you've got the geography of that sort of basin around LA too.
There is that as well. And like I said before, they're doing plenty of burning already. We should also say that there's a whole area about the response from Karen Bass and Gavin Newsom, in particular Karen Bass being on holiday in Ghana. that didn't help much.
She doesn't hold the hoses, mate.
That's the point. Yeah. That's not what caused the fire. You might say that it didn't help people, that they did various things at the beginning of the fire. They were lax to declare an emergency, for instance. The funding levels of the fire department were maybe not what they should be. There's a lot of criticisms, and I could go them in more detail, and I will in the podcast. We're just short of time at the moment, so I'll just leave that for now. But I just want to make one point. As far as whether the fires started because of brush or because of water or because of all those issues, we need to remember one vital bit of context, and that is California is not the only place that struggles with wildfires. Republicans are acting like Californians are particularly negligent, but at least in 2022, California had only the 7th most acres burnt by wildfires in America, despite California being considerably larger than most of the other states on that list. This is a serious problem that's affecting right across America, and people playing politics as if Californians are particularly at fault is ridiculous, okay? There are things that people can do to mitigate and to reduce the risk, but wildfires are going to happen in the real world, and you need to provide relief funding for people who lose their houses. It's pretty simple.
Yeah, ideologues, politicians, the media looking for a single cause is really, it's a ridiculous situation. Like the old analogy, an airliner doesn't crash because one thing goes wrong, it's because 10 things go wrong or 100 things go wrong. For Republicans in Washington to be talking about withholding federal disaster relief, that's extraordinary. They didn't do that when the hurricane hit, Florida and Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina last year. For them to be pressuring state governments and the taxpayers of California in this way by saying, you won't get money unless you change your ways to our way, it would seem to be quite inappropriate. But let's get an expert opinion on this. Jeff Schlegelmilch is the director of the National Centre for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University. Jeff, welcome back to Planet America.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
In the last week or two, Jeff, we have heard a lot of blame and accusations being thrown around these California wildfires. From what you have seen and heard, what concerned you most? What concerns that have you heard that are resonating with you?
Well, I think with everything going on, anytime there's a disaster, it's really the intersection of a lot of different factors. And I think the most important factor here is the weather and the dryness of the area. So LA has always been in a tough spot with wildfires, sort of being in these hilly areas with a lot of dry foliage. You have a lot of conditions that have come together, a very wet season and the prior winter and spring, which led to a lot of foliage growing, a very dry season now, very, very high Santa Ana winds leading to just conditions that really, really spread these wildfires. Now, there are other things around the edges, questions around like the maintenance of a reservoir that might have affected water pressure. And I think around the edges, these are important things to understand, but these disasters don't really occur at this scale because of disaster policy. They occur at this scale because of lack of recognition of some of these vulnerabilities in the way that we build and the increasing threats we're facing as a result of climate change.
So, Jeff, are you of the view that when a fire starts in these kinds of conditions, with this kind of dryness and these kinds of winds, that basically there's no stopping it? It's just a question of how big that fire is?
Yeah, I mean, there's always things that can be done and should be done to try and reduce the size, but it's very, very difficult to put out at that point. And so, and then how much ground can you make up when the winds do die down, when you get those lulls to put it out? So I wouldn't go as far as to say as it doesn't matter, but I would say that once conditions get this bad, it's very, very hard to actually solve this in that acute response phase. You're sort of just working with what you have, and it's not a very good situation.
So clearly, Jeff, the biggest way to prevent these kinds of unstoppable fires is for it to rain more consistently, not too much, not too little, just enough to stop the fires catching hold. Short of that, though, we can't wave a magic wand. What about the other things that we hear? President-elect Trump likes the idea of diverting water from Canada to have more water available to fight these fires, or raking forests. Others say that, well, we need better forest management, controlled burns and so on. Are there things in that area that you would say, yeah, there's some merit to it?
Yeah, everything with the possible exception of diverting water from Canada are all viable ideas when brought and pulled together as a whole. So forest management is really important in terms of managing the fuel that actually catches on fire. The materials that we build with are really important. I will say that in general, water resource management is very important to make sure we have the resources to put fires out, as well as potentially to irrigate areas and keep them from drying out, and even what we plant. Certain types of foliage are more flammable than others, and you'll even see that in some areas where certain types of trees have burnt, and then others that are more fire resistant haven't fared as badly. So there's quite a lot that can be done to help reduce the vulnerability to wildfires, and I think that'll be a very, very important part of the rebuilding process.
If we look at the water question for a second, at least according to the LA authorities, there was no shortage of water. There was a shortage of water pressure. And with their old system, it's not so good in these circumstances. Is that the kind of thing that's fixable, an entire water system, or is it just simply too big a problem to face, too expensive?
Yeah, it's a really important question, because I can sit here as an academic and say, yeah, just modernize all the water systems around. And of course, I'm sitting here in New York City, which has, hundreds of years of infrastructure that's been built on top of each other, with buildings and people and lives who don't want things being dug up in front of them or to pay higher taxes. So it is always a more complex question than that. So I think looking at the consequences, looking at the importance of having that water pressure, of having modern infrastructure as part of the overall portfolio for managing these disasters is important and probably deserves more weight than it's getting. But to your point, it's not like we can wave a magic wand or even blink an eye or even spend a year and expect at the end of that year for it all to be modernized. It's a constant process, and it's no small task.
When we're talking about forest management, Jeff, it's all very well to try and manage a forest, but some of these fires began in an urban area. You can't control burn inside a city. So how do you stop the buildup of material for fires inside the city rather than outside the city?
And that's a really important point, especially in urban areas like LA, because the fire once it reaches a certain point, you're absolutely right. It's not spreading through the forest, it's spreading through the urban area, through the built environment. And again, there's a lot that can be done, especially with the rebuilding that'll be done. We can build with more flame retardant materials. We can manage kind of foliage around the property to be more fire resistant and or further away from the property. And even having better access and better water resources. So if something does catch fire, if we can put that out very quickly and prevent that from spreading before it really, really gets out of hand. So the rebuilding process, I think, really should take a very close eye in terms of what can be done to actually prevent the urban part of this this fire system that's going on right now, multiple fires.
Great to get your insights, Jeff. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
So, Joe Biden's presidency is almost at an end. America's 46th president promised a return to normalcy and a more assertive role for the federal government, passing major legislation on infrastructure and climate, but often struggling with issues seemingly beyond his control, like inflation and foreign wars. So, how will history rate President Joe Biden?
CNN projects Joseph R. Biden Jr. is elected the 46th president of the United States.
4 years later, depending on who's talking, Joe Biden has been
an outstanding president who defended democracy at a moment of great danger.
Or
he's terrible. Worst president in our history by worst president.
The truth, as is often the case, probably sits somewhere in between. According to a 2023 survey of historians, Biden ranked in the top 1/3 of American presidents, 14th among the 45 men who've held the office, behind recent Democrats Obama and Clinton, but ahead of Republican icon Ronald Reagan and way in front of Donald Trump, who came dead last.
Well, I think that the greatest strength that Joe Biden had when we took the survey was that he wasn't Donald Trump. That he there was a real concern about the institution of the presidency and kind of the norms being displayed during the Trump administration about the way that Donald Trump approached presidential leadership. And Joe Biden very quickly moved to restore traditional approaches to presidential leadership in most ways.
That survey, though, was taken shortly after Biden announced he was running for a second term. Despite having just turned 80, he was buoyed by the Democrats' strong showing in the midterms.
The question we're facing is whether in the years ahead we have more freedom or less freedom, more rights or fewer. I know what I want the answer to be, and I think you do too. This is not a time to be complacent.
But of course, by June last year, it seemed that time was catching up with Joe Biden.
Everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Weeks later, Biden became the first president in over half a century to end their re-election campaign.
The president making that announcement around noon today, saying this: I have decided not to accept the nomination and to focus all my energies on my duties as president for the remainder of my term.
Harris's defeat last November led to a lot of finger-pointing at Biden for staying in too long, tarnishing his legacy, they said. But maybe Biden was always setting himself up to fail. He'd won office in 2020, setting himself an enormous, maybe impossible task.
I sought this office to restore the soul of America. Welcome to the Oval Office. Come on in.
So, how to assess Joe Biden's 4 years in office? Supporters will point to his legislative achievements during his first 2 years in particular, when Democrats could still muster majorities in the House and Senate. Almost $2 trillion in pandemic aid, also cutting poverty and boosting jobs. Biden delivered something that had eluded Trump, almost $1 trillion in bipartisan infrastructure spending. He also secured passage of the CHIPS bill to ensure semiconductors were once again being made in America. And there was the Inflation Reduction Act, which was also the largest ever climate bill. Democratic National Committee member Elaine Kamarck also thinks that Joe Biden had a strong record on foreign affairs.
I think he'll be remembered as a very good president, a very solid president who took the reins after a very, very chaotic presidency. I think he'll mostly be remembered for his righting the ship internationally and going back to NATO and saying, yes, we believe in NATO, we're with you, we believe in our alliances. I think he'll be remembered for the strong way he stood up to Russia and supported Ukraine.
His critics maintained Biden lost control of the southern border. Some claimed he was too close to Israel in their war in Gaza. Others that he wasn't close enough. He gave too much support to Ukraine's defence against Russia, or he didn't go far enough. He finally ended the two-decade war in Afghanistan, but it was a chaotic and deadly end. And Conservatives argued that Biden's big spending fuelled post-pandemic inflation. According to political scientist Larry Sabato, Biden's greatest liability, his age, was also tied to his greatest attribute, the experience he gained from almost half a century in elected Washington politics.
I think he should be remembered as a very experienced and able person who understood government, who, when his turn came, he used it well. He accomplished a lot. He knew what he was doing, and he managed to do it in a lot of cases. Problem is, of course, he shouldn't have run again. He should have planned to pass the presidency along, maybe to Kamala Harris or maybe to someone else.
And that decision to first run again and then belatedly bow out, followed by the re-election of Donald Trump, will for now be a major part of Biden's legacy, although Biden himself continues to defend the choices he made.
Mr. President, do you regret your decision to run for re-election? Do you think that that made it easier for your predecessor to now become your successor?
I don't think so. I think I would have beaten Trump, could have beaten Trump, and I think that Kamala could have beaten Trump and would have beaten Trump.
So interesting to me, Chaz, that Biden is still saying, I could have won, I would have won. On the one hand, it seems like a kind of an old man in denial, but also it kind of reminds us that to be the kind of person who wants to become President of the United States, serves as President of the United States, you need to have this incredible level of self-belief, even when all the evidence, including your own debate performance, Joe Biden, suggests to everybody else in the world something very different.
Well, look, it's mathematically possible that he could have won, but let's put it this way. Over the last couple of years of Biden's term, one of the greatest marketing techniques was this shirt, which I'm wearing now in commemoration, which this dark Brandon t-shirt, which let's not forget, was ironic.
Yeah.
It was the reason they're acting like he's some Terminator was because that's so ridiculous, because he was a feeble old man. And I think when we're talking about what history will look back on with Joe Biden, it's impossible to know how his policies are going to look in 10 years' time. A lot of them were long-term policies.
Yeah.
But one thing we could be sure of is one of the things he can be remembered is because he hung around too long.
Yeah.
Because he was too old. That is something that differentiates him from every other president. That's how he was historical. And I don't think there's no way you can get away from that.
Yeah, and the recent death of Jimmy Carter reminds us that there can be a final act. Joe Biden is presumably not going to get another 40 years, as Jimmy Carter did, to redeem his reputation. But you're right, history does get rewritten. And once sort of the heat of the political moment dissipates and you get these more objective, less ideological assessments of what was achieved. And as you say, things like infrastructure, we don't know for 10 years. Manufacturing, we won't know for 10 years. A lot of things we won't know. And we'll know Biden was a success when others take a lot of credit for it as well.
Yeah, well, and on that note, can I also say that his strength may be his weakness in that regard, in that, yes, as some of those policies mature over time, they may provide incredible benefits that people might look back on kindly. But at the same time, one of the knocks on Biden is why so much of your policy didn't take place until after the election.
Right.
Like the broadband program, which literally not a single person has been connected to broadband yet, which is scheduled to happen in 2026 and 2027.
Yep.
Why would you set up a program which takes that long to deliver?
Yeah, it was bad politics in a lot of cases, bad communication in some. Others, it was trying to be good economically, not to fuel inflation too much by spending too much all of a sudden, to kind of stage it over time, but get it locked in now, well, in that first 2-year period when Democrats had the numbers they could muster to pass big pieces of legislation. But as you say, time will tell. Our next guest may also tell. We are joined by former Vermont Governor Dr. Howard Dean, who of course ran for the Democratic presidential nomination himself in 2004, then went on to become chair of the Democratic Party. Governor Dean, welcome back to the program.
Thanks very much for having me again.
I wonder how, in your view, does the presidency of Joe Biden deserve to be remembered?
Well, I think history, of course, takes a little time. I think it's going to be remembered very well. This is a guy who accomplished more in one term than anybody since Lyndon Johnson on the domestic front. He's created hundreds of thousands of jobs. Unfortunately for him, they were almost all in red states. He forgave a ton of student loans. He actually had a very good immigration program, and the Republicans killed it so they could run on it during the campaign. So I think Biden will be fondly remembered by historians because of his achievements, but that's, as usual, won't happen for a few years after he's left.
On that note, Biden seems to be of the view that many of his accomplishments, especially in the realms of promoting local industry, won't bear fruit for some years, but will bear fruit somewhere down the track. Do you agree with that?
Yes, and in two ways, which actually one of which affects Australia potentially. One of the things that Biden did is, in addition to investing in a lot of renewable energy in Republican districts, so that now they're going to have a hard time voting against it and putting 30,000 people out of work, and as well as car factories and all that. But one thing he did, which is extraordinary, is he onshored a lot of the chip industry. And that's going to change the body politic in the world, because one of the reasons that the United States wouldn't hesitate to come to the defense of Taiwan in the case of a Chinese attack is because of their predominance in the chip world. They make the most advanced chips in the world. Because of what Biden did, that's no longer going to be true in 4 or 5 years. And so that's going to change the chemistry in your part of the world. So, you know, these things are all interconnected. But I do think it's good for America to onshore these chips that we need, that are a part of every life, from the lowliest person working for minimum wage to the Air Force commander. That's going to be a big, big difference. And I don't think people have any understanding of that at all.
Governor, one analysis of Joe Biden's presidency has been he was a good president, he got a lot done, but he wasn't good at communicating what he did wrong. And Joe Biden wasn't a great communicator. Yet, back in 2016, there was a similar analysis. Barack Obama was a good president who got a lot done, but he wasn't good at communicating. And obviously, Barack Obama was a great communicator. So is this more not so much the individual, but the Democrats have a message problem?
Well, the Democrats definitely have a message problem. I do think that there certainly was some cognitive decline for President Biden. And I think his people concealed that to a certain extent. So that part of the problem was his age. And I am a Biden fan, so I don't say that with any glee at all. It happens to all of us. It'll happen to me sooner or later, or maybe sooner. But I do think that had an effect. But his staff, in terms of executing policy, was really, really excellent, and so was he.
So if you think in hindsight there was a cognitive decline problem towards the end, how do you think it should have been dealt with in hindsight?
In hindsight, obviously, he should have decided, he announced early he wasn't going to run, but that's in hindsight. And once you get into it, I do think there have been some speculation that his staff concealed how concerned they were about his cognitive decline. I think there's probably some truth to that.
Did they not just conceal it from the American public, but from Biden himself? Because just this week, he's out there saying, yeah, I could have won last November. I think I would have won last November. And then he admitted, well, yeah, but I don't know if I would have been okay for the next 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, at least that's more frank than most people are in Washington. So I give him credit for saying that.
Governor, we're talking a lot about messaging in this interview, but Biden is leaving office with a favourability rating of 33%. Why is that?
I think people think he's old and they want to move on. That's not so uncommon. You know, I think he'll be fine. The historians really look at what he did. He'll end up somewhere in the top half. He's a one-termer, but what he's done to change the country is extraordinary. I mean, I hated Lyndon Johnson with a passion because he was lying about the Vietnam War. But if you look at what Lyndon Johnson did domestically, he was the most extraordinary president since Franklin Roosevelt. Medicaid, Medicare, civil rights, nobody could have done the things he did. So history has a way of readjusting where people belong in the pantheon of presidencies, and I think Biden will do just fine.
I wonder, Governor, knowing Biden as you do, and he was literally telling people when he was 7 years old in the 1940s that he was going to be president one day. And he finally got there at the third attempt, quite late in his political career. What regrets, what unfinished business do you think, Joe Biden would mark himself down, whether it's through what he was able to achieve or the situation or the scenario that he was in as president, the things that he would have liked to have done that he didn't get done?
I think he would have liked to land harder on Netanyahu and try to bring that situation to a close. Netanyahu is basically Trump with brains, and he's not, I think, doing a terribly good job of standing up for his own people. And I think Biden would have liked to have been harder on him. I think Biden would have liked to have 4 more years so that the extraordinary things he's done in places like Ohio with the car factories and the chip factories and the renewable energy would have had time to really get to full fruition. I think that's inevitable anyway, because now all those jobs are not going to be given up by Republican congressmen, I don't think. I mean, they all voted against all this stuff, and then they went and clipped the ribbon with them in their home districts, even though they voted against the projects, which, politicians are the same everywhere. I'm sure that goes on in Australia as well.
And finally, from me, Governor, the hindsight police are out at the moment amongst the Democrats, which I think is a healthy process to look back and self-evaluate after an election loss. And I just want to throw 4 theories that the Democrats are throwing around at the moment at you and see if any of them seem appealing to you at all, or if you think they're all rubbish. Number 1, the Democrats moved too far to the left culturally the last few years. Number 2, the stimulus was too big in the beginning and it led to more inflation than would otherwise occur. Number 3, the Joe Manchin took over the Inflation Reduction Act and it would have been different if Biden had controlled it a little bit more. And 4, that Biden showed too much deference towards the Sanders wing of the party when crafting policy, and he ended up steering the government more to the left than he would have liked. Do you have any views about any of them?
Yeah, I think it's mostly BS, as we say. I really do. I mean, look, those people who come up with these theories, most of them never get outside Washington. So how are they expected to have any idea what's going on in the rest of the country? If they had some idea what was going on in the rest of the country, Biden would probably be elected to a second term, although his cognitive deficiencies were a serious problem no matter what happened. I think from a social point of view, it's not that we moved too far to the left on social issues. It's that we allowed those to become the issues. 0.1% of kids in the United States may be transgender. We're going to have an election to determine the presidency on that. Well, that's because we let them do that. And that was stupid. I mean, it had nothing to do with what the policy was. It was being outmaneuvered by people who were totally unscrupulous, lied every day, usually 50 times a day, and got the better of us because we didn't have the backbone to punch them right back in the nose, which they deserved. So I certainly don't think that the inflation was caused by the Inflation Reduction Act or the stimulus. I think if you want to blame inflation, you can blame that on Trump if you want to, because he was actually in charge when the pandemic struck. And that's where a lot of the money was put in and so forth. And then Biden did the same. So I think the real problem was we did get outmaneuvered. We are a much too inside the Beltway party. We don't talk to people outside. We don't respect people outside. And I'm not talking about respecting working people. Most people inside the Beltway are very smart, and they have no understanding whatsoever of what it takes to win an election in the United States of America. Obama was an exception because he was the most charismatic president we've had in a long time. And Clinton was an exception because he was the best. He's probably the greatest political talent I've ever met in my life in politics. But most of the time, the Democrats have much better ideas. We're much nicer people, and we just have to get used to punching people in the nose and being much tougher. And we're somehow subsumed with this idea that as long as we're safe inside our little world of the Beltway, when we can be smarter than everybody else, that'll do. Well, it won't do. And I don't think we've forgotten working class people, but I do think we've forgotten how to talk to working class people. And that is, and we're now seeing the results of what happens when you do that.
Governor, as always, great to get your thoughts. Thanks for taking the time for us.
Thanks for having me on.
Joe Biden delivered what is expected to be his final address from the Oval Office of the White House yesterday, as well as running through what he sees as his administration's and his own major achievements. He issued a warning for the future with echoes of the past.
I'm equally concerned about the potential rise of a tech industrial complex that could pose real dangers for our country as well. Americans are being buried under an avalanche of misinformation and disinformation, enabling the abuse of power. The free press is crumbling. Editors are disappearing. Social media is giving up on fact-checking. The truth is smothered by lies told for power and for profit.
Of course, talking about the tech industrial complex there, Biden deliberately paraphrasing the farewell address of President Eisenhower in 1961, who at that time warned of the influence of what he termed the military industrial complex and the threat it posed to world peace at the time of the height of the Cold War. Eisenhower, who had himself, he was no peacenik, he'd been Allied Supreme Commander in World War II. He was talking about the urgent need for disarmament and how the military-industrial complex was fueling the potential for war. And as we know, as the 1960s progressed, America got mired in the war in Vietnam. So will Joe Biden's warnings about America's new tech oligarchs and attacks on the free press ring as true in decades to come as Eisenhower's warnings have since 1961?
Well, look, I'd suggest that Biden had a lot less problem with the tech oligarchs when they were under his thumb,
True.
rather than now they're under Trump's thumb. I mean, that's what's changed. What's changed is they've switched sides, and they've switched sides because they've gone where the power is,
right?
Which is what big business always does.
Right.
There's nothing new about that.
So this is cynicism or pragmatism, good business, rather than an ideological awakening by these lefties from Silicon Valley.
That's what I think. I mean, and I think there's some evidence for that. For instance, just in the last couple of weeks, Mark Zuckerberg has done, I think, a humiliating turn, where he's suddenly reinvented himself as some sort of masculine advocate, and some.
Has he been working out?
He's been doing lots of that and talking about how need more masculinity and how he's changed Facebook's practices now because it's all about free speech. They're going back to their roots. They're not worried about fact checking anymore, and he's just fired all the fact checkers. Well, according at least to Brazilian newspaper Globo, when the Brazilian government investigated what was going on here with Facebook, Facebook said the decision to end the fact-checking program will apply for now only in the United States. So it turns out that Mark Zuckerberg doesn't mind fact-checking everywhere else outside the United States. Obviously, he's trying to appeal to Donald Trump.
Either that,
sucking
or
up the power.
you could reasonably argue that Americans have demonstrated they're not interested in facts anymore, so it's wasted effort.
There is that. Either way, I think that the tech oligarchs moving en masse towards Trump is just typical of big business. That's a classic corporate move. As far as misinformation, disinformation goes, I know that's been a theme that's been going through the Biden administration, concern about misinformation. You only need to look at some of the misinformation from the last couple of years that was cracked down on, how there's been re-evaluations about some of that misinformation that maybe what the facts were thought at the time were wrong.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with cracking down on misinformation. Who decides what's misinformation and what's not misinformation?
Yeah,
it's always the issue.
I accept what you say about Biden being a little bit hypocritical because they're suddenly not on his side anymore. But the warning about oligarchs, I think, is interesting. He's clearly talking about Elon Musk and others. And, of course, Elon Musk is about to have literally a job in the Trump administration, and one that will probably end in tears quite quickly, whether it's his tears or Marco Rubio's tears. I don't imagine this is an arrangement that's going to last very, very long, but until it all falls apart, it is a different stage. It is a more open influence from the world's richest man, who literally now has a swipe card and a pen on a desk, and it's like, okay, Elon, welcome to the office. Can I get you a coffee?
Yeah, look, I agree. I think there is a problem. I don't think it's a tech oligarch problem. I think it's an Elon Musk problem.
Yeah.
The problem is that the world's richest man has decided to throw his money and his power and his influence around as much as he possibly can to leave us the biggest possible imprint on the public conversation through both Twitter and outside Twitter.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. That's not about Facebook. That's not about Peter Thiel.
Yeah.
That's about Elon Musk alone.
Yeah.
They've got a problem there. And what happens? I don't know.
Yeah, and in 4 years from now, Donald Trump will be an ex-president in his 80s, fading away as Joe Biden is now. Elon Musk will probably still be the world's richest man. That's it for another trip to Planet America. We will be back on Wednesday night at 9:30 p.m. on ABC TV.
And you can find us on Facebook, YouTube, and iView. And Pep is going to be back next week.
Bye-bye.